ageless. I am ageless and free. Just as fall turns to winter and winter to spring, in some areas of the world, I experience change in my life that may affect the way I look or feel about myself and others. Yet there's no change in my age or physical appearance or life that can alter the underlying truth. Through the Spirit of God within, I am ageless and free from limitations. I am a living expression of God's love and life. Young or old in spirit, I welcome each moment as an opportunity to find a new way to express my divine nature. God's love in me frees me from the limitations of the past and inspires me to live joyously now. Like new buds in the spring, I am born anew each day. I am ready to follow where Spirit leads. I am ageless and free. This is Daniel 2. Blessed be the name of God from age to age, for wisdom and power are His. So just appreciate everybody being here. We're always excited about Paul's talks. And I was telling somebody earlier last week, and I love history, but I just wasn't that, I don't know, for some reason wasn't that excited about Athens. That was just my deal. And then Paul brings all these things into it, and I get excited about it. And I'm still waiting. I can't wait till next week. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you're going to tell us about the connection of Texas to the sacred cities, or
well, to all sacred cities, yeah.
Right.
But particularly Rome.
Oh, Rome. Okay, good. Glad to get that clarification. So that stay tuned for that. So we do, and John Lipinski has been taping these, and if you do want one, and I think Colin might have a way we can get them on YouTube or something, so we check with Colin or I or something, because that'll be just a special thing. And I've got a friend back home I accidentally sent the information to about Paul's talk, and he wanted to drive out to Dallas, 400 miles to here. His name was John, and I meant to send it to John Lipinski, so John missed one of my messages. But just so grateful that you're here, and looking forward to hearing about Alexandria, and just look forward to all the information we'll receive today. So thank you.
Thank you, Barry. It's just always a treat to be here. Colin has put it on YouTube or put it online. So maybe later you can put the address up for folks.
Here, and I'll send it out if anybody wants to. We'll get it. Yeah.
Okay, so if you're interested in this kind of thing, it is on videotape. Now, last week we talked about Athens, and it does sound kind of like a dull topic. It was for me until I got into it also, Barry, and realized really how very, very important Athens was and is to our culture. Now, the same thing applies to Alexandria, but to explain that requires quite a bit of background and history, so I'm going to try to do that today. In the 5th century BC, the golden age of Athens, the Greeks had one huge fear, and that was that the Persians were going to wipe them out and take over their culture. And this happened because the Persians had invaded Greece and had gotten almost to Athens. If they'd gotten to Athens and destroyed Athens, the history would be so different. The golden age would be so different. Everything. If there, I don't know that there would have been a golden age. There are so many things that hang on this. I have a question for you, and you all know the answer, I think. Most of you know the answer to this. How close did the Persians get to Athens? And you have to think through this. You all know the answer, or you can come pretty close to the answer. But what city just north of Athens where they stopped? Boom.
That's where the, starts with S.
You ready? Again, I'll give you a big hint, okay?
Sparta?
Every year around Dallas, they will have certain athletic competition known as a, right, Marathon is the name of the city. How close is Marathon? Point 2, 3, 4. 26.4 miles. So that's exactly how far it is. That's how close they got. Now, 24.6 miles in today's world is nothing, right? But 26.4 miles in that world was a much greater distance. For one thing, it's about what you could walk in a day. But running, a fast runner, how fast do they run that? Well,
An hour and 15 minutes.
yeah,
Less than 2.
yeah, I think elite runners have, the Boston Marathon, for example. The elite runners run it in under 2 hours, of course. But an average runner could run it probably in 2.5 hours. Well, unless your name's Paul Bruner, then you can run it in 1 hour and 3 minutes. As you can see, Paul is an incredible physical specimen, and
What is the shoes?
but it's all about the shoes, right? So anyway, the reason I mention that is that's how important marathon was to the Greeks, that they immortalized it with the race. You know, basically what they were doing is remembering, and so a bunch of people would run the race, and then that just became a tradition, right? And then runners around the world have always looked up or strived for or worked toward running a marathon. Now, keeping that in mind, it was the obsession of the Greeks to permanently end the possibility of the Persians invading again. And this just comes down to us, of course, to Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great, one thing that you want to say about Alexander the Great is this. There are very few people that actually deserve the title great. For Peter the Great, for example. Peter the Great was pretty important in Russia, but had just had an impact in that one country. Alexander the Great literally changed the world and set up so many things that profoundly influence us to this day. And I'll be going through those things because they all eventually relate back to the city of Alexandria. So Alexander the Great was a young man in his 20s when his father, Philip, died. Now, Philip was planning an invasion of Asia, primarily to defeat, if possible, or certainly to limit the power of the Persians. The Persians had spread all the way from what is Iran today, all the way into Greece. And so Alexander was very young, very brash, and thought that when his father died, he could do it. And so from the very beginning, his plan was to invade and destroy the Persian army and eventually get to the Persian capital, Persepolis, and eventually just to wipe out that culture. Well, of course he did, but the question is, how did he do it? Because although he had a large army, he had nothing compared to what the Persians had. And how was this young man able to conquer so much of the world at such a young age? And the answer is this. This is the most important piece of the pie. A phalanx. Now, a phalanx was a relatively new military technique that the Greeks invented, perfected, and used to tremendous results against the Persians. Now, what is a phalanx? The best way to think of a phalanx is this. It's a human tank. So what they did, they would have an assembly. Sometimes it would be in various shapes, but often it was in the shape of a triangle. Now, a phalanx could be pretty small, you know, maybe 20 people and so forth. And these little dots here, which I didn't get straight, are representing the helmets of soldiers. And so what they would do is they would put shields, interlocking shields around the sides and on the back, so that if arrows came or if lances came toward them, they put up the shields and basically nothing could get through. And if they were really in a very tight situation where there was enormous amount of incoming particular arrows, they would then have men in the middle put shields up. And the shield on top then made it complete, they were self-contained. Now this is the reason, to this day, why in the military, the very first thing you learn is how to march. Now what's marching all about? Marching had to be perfect inside the phalanx. If you want to have one guy who is out of step, over a period of space, length, the phalanx would start to fall apart, see, if one person were lagging or so on. So it was incredibly important that they march exactly in the same rhythm at the same time. And here this tank comes forward. Now, what Alexander would do is well known. He would face this huge army lined up against him. And he always tried to take the initiative. He didn't like to be attacked. He wanted to attack. And so he'd get these phalanxes. Now, we're talking about a huge field of battle. Hundreds and hundreds of phalanxes. Some small, some larger. But the idea was to come up to the enemy line. And they're throwing their spears and their lances and they're doing their arrows. And nothing stops the phalanx because it just keeps coming. And then at one point, they can stop. When they get close enough, they can just stop, drop the shields for maybe 5 seconds, and they'll then take their arrows and concentrate their fire at one spot in the line. Well, here's our good friend Amir. Don't be quiet. Come in. Have a seat in the front row.
Oh, man.
This is my favorite Iranian by the name of Amir. Thank you. Good to see you, man. Have a seat
Front
here.
row, okay.
Yeah, front and center as always. Amir has just graduated from the University of Dallas, and he is now a teacher and headed up to all kinds of interesting, neat things. But he's heard, he knows where I'm going with this talk, because he's very, very interested in that ancient Persian culture. Obviously, you know, the word Amir means the one with light, the one who comes with light, the one who shines bright. So Alexander knew very well what the Persian military situation was. So as soon as they broke a hole, they didn't have to make too big a hole. He'd send the cavalry through the hole. So the cavalry is always behind the phalanx, ready to go through. But it's the phalanx that breaks the hole. You've heard the expression divide and conquer. That, of course, is exactly what Alexander is up to. So these phalanxes were enormously successful. In fact, they became so powerful that enemies of the Greeks and then later the Romans, they'd see the phalanx coming, they'd just run. Because they knew if the phalanx got close enough, they'd have that firepower. See, because in other words, they drop those shields, they shoot their arrows, and then the shields come up immediately. Okay? And then they go another 50 yards, and then do the same thing. See, so this is extremely important to understand how this one young man could conquer the world. So he comes over into Asia, which in those days is what we call the Middle East, Turkey. He's in Turkey. So he crosses down, defeats the Persian army sent against him, goes down, defeats other armies, ultimately gets down where the Holy Land is. And the Jews, now this is around the year 322 BC. So the Jews, small country, they knew they didn't have a chance against Alexander. So they just simply said, welcome, ruler, welcome, king, welcome, our new pharaoh, our new emperor. They realized that that was their only hope. And it turned out good for the Jews, because then the Jews eventually live in Alexander's kingdom for the next 300 years, but most particularly in Alexandria. Now, wherever Alexander the Great went, he founded cities, and he always named them after himself. Or if they were already, if you want to take over a city, he'd say the name of the city and then Alexandria. Or Alexander this or something. It's always about Alexander's influence on these places. By the time he got to India, he had founded 72 cities of Alexandria. And so almost all of them reverted back to their original names or a Greek name, secondary Greek name, because the one city that when you say Alexandria, one city everybody knew was the one in Egypt. Now, he came then, eventually, he wanted to go to Egypt for one particular reason. There was a famous oracle there. Now, we have, in the past, talked about oracle. Now, the word oracle comes from the word opening. The original oracle is at Delphi in Greece. This is the most important of all the Greek religious sites. There was a crack in the ground, and it's believed that in those days, smoke rose out of it. Think Yellowstone Park here. In other words, there was some thermal activity going on, and smoke would rise out. And that thermal activity would make a lot of noise. So they would listen to the crack and they'd hear all that noise. But in their imagination, they dreamed or believed that those were the dead, because they believed the dead lived in the underworld. And that the dead somehow would always know the answer to things, past, present, and future. So if you wanted to have things explained, if you wanted to have things understood that's happened to you in the past, or things that are going to happen to you in the future, you would go to Delphi. And what would happen is a young lady would sit on a tripod over the crack and go into a trance. And in this trance, she would hear voices. And these voices would tell her something. And so she would say, have some strange sentence that she would come up with after she came out of the trance. And there would always be a priest there to interpret what was said. So you understand how far removed you are. In other words, from the gurgling of water to whatever this girl came to her mind, to whatever the priest thought she was saying, you see, the point is, who knows what God said, right? And but people believed in this deeply, so they would go there, and So oracles then can be anything. It can be a crack in the earth. It can be a crystal ball. It can be tea leaves. The Romans were very big on being gut gazers. They would take an animal and they would, on the altar, they would lay out the animal, almost always a ram, male, of course, because it wasn't too big, and they'd cut it open. The guts would fall out, and then they'd study the guts and tell you what the future was. And you say, well, that's crazy. Yeah, we have such things today that people do and have faith in. One of those things is we call science, right? And people have great faith that science is going to solve our problems. Well, interesting, science does solve many of our problems, but so did gut gazing. They would look at the guts and they would say, okay, now you come, we're interpreting the guts for you here, and this is what you need to do. This is what's going to happen to you if you don't do it, that kind of thing. And so sometimes we extremely help, right? People got PhDs in gut gazing, or the equivalent, right? And it was, I think, an important point to make is that oracles existed as places, but also as kind of concept, horology. I mean, not horology. What am I saying? Astrology, the study of the stars, right? Study of the stars line up. Something's going to happen, and that certainly had as much validity as any of the rest of it, right? Now, I mention this because there was an oracle, Siwa, in Egypt, very, very famous from way, way back. And Alexander knew about it. He wanted to find out his future. So he went along the coast, founded the city of Alexandria, then went way out into the desert to this oasis called Siwa. And there he asked them what was going to happen. And whatever they said to him, he interpreted to mean that he was going to conquer the world. And he believed it. And that gave him impetus, to continue then going east through the Persian Empire all the way to India, where he was never defeated. The problem is, every time he won a battle, there was another civilization, another country, endlessly. And so he never did get to it. Now, this oracles play an important role in history, and this is a classic example of Alexander going to an oracle and that giving him the courage, the initiative, and then the mandate. In other words, this said, you are supposed to go out there and conquer the world. So he did. In other words, he did conquer the world, at least that was known at that time. Now, one of the many things that we need to know about Alexandria in Egypt is that the Jews found it to be a very attractive place to live. And so it is said there were more Jews living in Egypt than there were actually in Israel. And of those, most of those people lived in Alexandria in the Jewish quarter. And nobody knows how many, but there were hundreds of thousands of Jews that lived there. And what happened to those Jews is very interesting. They start moving in the 300s. By the time you get down to the 200s, the Jews in Alexandria are getting very worried because they're starting to become Egyptian, right? And they are becoming Greek, and they're losing their interest in the scriptures. And fewer of them learn how to read the Jewish scripture, and certainly are not speaking Hebrew anymore. and they're even to the point where they can't read the scripture in the synagogue, which is the most important thing to them. So they come up with a solution that's really, really important for history. And that solution is known as the Septuagint. Now the Septuagint, which means the 70, these are the 70 men who were then hired to translate the Torah, first 5 books of the Bible, into Greek. Now, this may not sound like a big deal, but it was a huge deal because, first of all, the Greek ruler of Egypt named Ptolemy the original Ptolemy was, of course, one of the most important generals of Alexander the Great. So when Alexander the Great died, the big prize was Egypt, and it was given to Ptolemy because he was at that time kind of second in command. So the Ptolemies then ruled Egypt for the next 300 years, more or less. And of course, remember from history, who was the last Ptolemy to rule Egypt?
Cleopatra.
Correct. Cleopatra with her red hair. And Cleopatra, of course, infamous in so many ways. She had 2 lovers who, of course, history knows very well. The first, of course, was Julius Caesar. And she had an affair with him. And then this is before the Romans actually ruled Egypt. And then, of course, her other affair with Mark Antony. And Mark Antony played so brilliantly by Marlon Brando in that movie version of Julius Caesar. Well, anyway, Cleopatra and the Ptolemies were very supportive of the Jews. So Ptolemy, at that time, Pharaoh, ruler of Egypt, said, I'll pay for it. So he pays for it. This Greek pays for the Jews to translate their own holy word into Greek. Now the Greek they translate into is not the Greek of the standard Greek of Egypt, but is known as Koine Greek. Now, Koine Greek is the Greek that evolved outside of Greece in the areas that Alexander the Great had conquered. Now, it's about the difference between English and American English. In reading, it's pretty, it's very similar. But there are differences of idiom, there are differences slang that evolved over time. So this happens, and the Septuagint then happens in the 3rd century BC, the 200s, and the 200s. So it becomes really important because people outside of Judaism can now read the Torah, first 5 books of the Old Testament. And that starts to spread the word about Judaism to people outside of that religion. But more to the point is that later on, when Jesus quotes the Torah, which he does often, he does not quote the original Hebrew, but he quotes the Septuagint. You say, well, how do you know that? Because there's certain idioms and certain ways of saying things and certain words used in the Septuagint that are not used in the traditional Hebrew Bible. So that's important. That tells you right there